Today we're going to talk about Lesson 3, which is Scientific Investigations. Here are your state standards. If you would like to read them individually, feel free to pause. As you can see, there are many state standards that we are going to analyze and evaluate as we go through this section. Alright, first thing, engage your brain, numbers 1 and 2, and active reading. Please feel free to pause this to do your questions, otherwise I'm going to keep going. So pause it, do your best. If you have questions, that'd be where you would want to write down questions on your visa. Scientists at work. What are some types of scientific investigations? There are two main types of scientific investigations, and that would be experiments and observations. An experiment is an organized procedure to study something under controlled conditions. So keywords being organized and controlled. We are going to be very organized and procedural as we go through an experiment, and we're going to try to control for all the conditions we possibly can. Remember, we talked about that with Beaker and Bunsen, controlling for the same kind of bed, the same pillows, the same sheets, in the sleep study that Dr. Honeydew was going to do. Experiments are often done in a laboratory to control factors that can influence a result. So we talked about in some classes that you'd want to make sure the temperature was the same in the room when Beaker slept during more light and during less light. Alright, I want you to pause again and do question number 5 on page 26. It would help you out a lot if you would read this section on experiments and then infer for number 5. Again, pause this if you have problems or questions. That's where you want to start writing some things down in your visa so that we can talk about these and have a great classroom discussion tomorrow. Other investigation types, remember we have observation as the other type along with experimentation. Observation is the process of obtaining information by using your senses. We've been talking about this since the start of the year. Your senses help you to make observations. Observation can also refer to the information obtained through your senses. Observations cannot always be made under controlled conditions. You may just make an observation walking down the hallway. You observe that one of the light bulbs are out. Number 6 on page 27 will help you analyze and find factors that scientists cannot always control for in field investigations, such as this picture here. Go ahead and do number 6 and then pause the video. Observations can be made anywhere and may give a better description of what is actually happening in nature. The creation of models is another type of investigation that we use to study something that's really small or really large or extremely complex and hard to understand. So models can also be a type of investigation. We talked about in lesson 2, models are great for something like the solar system model because it's so large, so vast that we can't wrap our heads around it. Something like the model of a molecule or an atom, to be able to understand something so small, to put your hands on it and to try to understand it. Models are great for that. Number 8 on page 28 is going to ask you to apply, to think of something that you've observed or read about that interests you, and then write a hypothesis about that thing. So I want you to do that. That would be something that you could do in your book beside a number 8. There's a blank spot. Be a great place for it. Go ahead and pause the video and do that now. A hypothesis is a testable idea or an explanation that leads to a scientific investigation. A hypothesis can be tested by an experiment or an observation. Now I want you to look back at number 8 that you did on page 28. Is it something that can be tested through an experiment or through an observation? If not, you may need to change your hypothesis. A variable is another part of a scientific investigation. It's any factor that can change in an experiment, an observation, or a model. Scientists try to change only one variable in an experiment and keep all other variables constant or unchanged. We talked about this earlier too. If you change more than one thing, you can't say that your results came from the thing you were testing or the other thing you forgot to control for. It could have been a combination of both. It could have been either. It could have been neither. You're not sure. Okay, I'd like you to do number 9 on page 29. go ahead and pause the video and identify what kind of data you would record for an experiment that tests whether snow protects leaves from cold temperatures. Data is another part of a scientific investigation, and data is information that's gathered by observations or experimentation that can be used when you're going to calculate or you're going to write a conclusion. You're going to reason why your results turned out the way they did. That's where you need data. All observations, experimental setups, and procedures must be recorded so details are not forgotten. Remember, experiments need to be repeatable and agreeable. If you don't write down every single step, all the details, someone else cannot repeat your experiment exactly as you did. What are some scientific methods? Scientific methods are ways in which scientists answer questions and solve problems. We've talked about this. We've gone through the scientific method with Beaker and Bunsen. But here I want to touch on the fact that scientists don't always use the same steps in every investigation, and sometimes they're not in the same order. After making an observation or reading a report, a scientist might then state a problem. The problem will be well defined or precisely stated, so it can actually be investigated. For our purposes, we're going to use the steps of the scientific method. We're first going to start with our problem, although, back to the first bullet point here, your problem might be coming from an observation that you made. When scientists form a hypothesis, they're making an educated guess about their problem, about what they think the answer to their problem is. Before you can test a hypothesis, scientists will often make a prediction about what will happen in their investigation. Scientific investigations must be carefully planned. You must decide where to conduct an investigation. You must decide the equipment and the technology that you'll need for your investigation. Scientists must identify all the variables that can affect the results before conducting an experiment, because they're going to need to control for those. And then scientists must decide which variables should change and which variables should stay constant. So remember, we talked about independent and dependent variables. The data collected in an investigation must be recorded and properly organized. So this is where your data table comes into play. We've been using these since the second day of school. When you did your speed lab, you made a data table to collect and properly organize and record your information. Data is often organized into tables, spreadsheets, or even graphs. Scientists then analyze the data they've collected during the investigation. That analysis helps them to draw conclusions about the results. Scientists have to conclude whether results of an investigation support their hypothesis. If the hypothesis is not supported, we call that a rejected hypothesis. Scientists will then need to think about the problem some more and try to come up with a new hypothesis. Scientists must be able to defend their conclusions. So that's just telling you that you have to be able to explain why you concluded, why your inferences, remember, they're not observations, they're based on your observations, but they're an inference as to why your experiment turned out the way it did. As a scientist, you have to be ready to defend that information. Right now, I want you to go to page 30 and do number 10. You're going to diagram. You're going to use a different color to draw arrows showing another path that a scientist might follow if they were observing animals in the wild. So it may not be that they define a problem, make a hypothesis, do the investigation, do the data, make the conclusion. Could it happen in a different order? How are scientific methods used? Different situations require different methods of testing a hypothesis. Even when an investigation does not support a hypothesis, the information can still be really productive and lead to new investigations. Even after several unsupported hypotheses, scientists continue to test the problems until they find a hypothesis that's supported. You want to know that you have an explanation for why your experiment is turning out the way it does. Okay, I want you to go to number 12 on page 32 and do apply, which is give another example of a scientific investigation that would require both observation and experiments. Number 13 on page 33, you're going to fill in this flowchart below with examples of scientific methods used in the gecko investigation. So you're going to need to read about the gecko investigation and then fill this in. Now, what are some ways to confirm that an investigation is valid? That means that it's useful and it was done properly. Peer reviews evaluate the methods used in a study and the conclusions reached by its authors. That means other scientists are out there reading your study. They're evaluating, is this something that's good? Is this good science or is this poor science? Even after a study is published, scientists must answer questions raised by other scientists. Your study could get published and have been peer-reviewed, and your peers thought this is a valid study, but then still other scientists may still want questions answered about your study. What are some ways to confirm that an investigation is valid? Again, replicating an investigation is an important way to confirm the findings of an investigation. So if you can redo it, remember, repeatable and agreeable. If you can repeat your investigation and it agrees with your first findings, that's a great way to show that your investigation is valid. Scientists disclose the methods and materials used in the study when they publish their findings. You are being very open. You've heard the word transparent, so everyone knows what methods, what materials, what machinery, right down to the make and model if you use some kind of technological device. Investigations that cannot be supported or repeated will not be accepted by the scientific community. So if someone else tries to do your investigation and it's not agreeable with the findings you found, they're going to call that not accepted. Most reliable scientific information is published in science journals. You can find a lot of different types of science journals out there. You could probably find a journal for almost anything scientific you could think of. Ecology, zoology, and then even more specific from there. Government or academic websites are the most reliable information on the internet. If you have a .gov or a .edu, you can trust that information on the internet. You're supposed to be able to trust that information. That's good sources. You have a .com or a .net, not as trustworthy. Lab reports in school need to meet the same standards as published studies. So we're going to do some lab reports, and I'm going to hold you to that same standard, that repeatable and agreeable. And is it valid? Did you use proper techniques and procedures as you went through? Okay, now I want you to do numbers 15 and 16 by yourself. Sorry, I don't have the page number here. Probably 34-ish, 35-ish. Go ahead and try these on your own. You can pause the video while you do them.